What if a single line in Genesis hides an entire world we were never taught to see? Genesis 40:16 tells us that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The verse passes quickly, almost like a footnote, but the words carry a weight that older readers did not overlook. Most people assume Nod is simply a patch of ground somewhere beyond the garden, a geographic detail meant to move the story forward. But the older traditions read this line very differently. They saw in Nod not only a location, but a condition, a region where the ordinary rules of nearness to God seemed to bend. In this reflection, we will walk through three movements together. First, we will look at what the name Nod actually means and why that meaning matters. Then, we will consider how Genesis frames Cain's departure, paying attention to what the text says and what it leaves quietly unsaid. And finally, we will begin to trace the older interpretive thread, especially the one preserved in the Ethiopian Christian tradition, which sees Nod as something more than a map point. And once we understand this first layer, the real story begins. The Hebrew word behind Nod comes from a root that means to wander, to shake, to be unsettled. It is not the name of a city. It is not the name of a tribe. It is the name of a state of being. When Genesis says Cain settled in the land of Nod, the wording carries a quiet contradiction. He settles in a place whose very name means restlessness. He builds a home in the country of wandering. The text does not explain this directly. It simply lets the tension stand, and that tension is part of what older readers tried to listen to. They asked a simple question. Why would the writer of Genesis choose a name that means unrest for the place where Cain finally stops moving? One answer is that the land was named after the man. Cain was the wanderer, and the territory took on the shape of his condition. Another answer, older and stranger, is that the land already carried that quality before Cain ever arrived. In this reading, Nod was a region of the earth where the steady presence of God did not rest in the same way it rested elsewhere. A place where the spiritual ground was thinner, a place where things could happen that would not happen closer to Eden. Genesis itself is careful and restrained on this point. It does not describe Nod. It does not tell us its borders. It does not tell us who, if anyone, lived there before Cain. The text simply says he went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt there. That phrase, out from the presence of the Lord, is worth pausing on. In the language of Genesis, the presence of the Lord is not a metaphor for general awareness. It is the active, sustaining nearness of God that filled the garden and lingered around the family of Adam. To go out from that presence is not only to walk in a different direction, it is to step into a different relationship with creation itself. The text does not say God abandoned Cain. The mark on his forehead suggests the opposite, but it does say that Cain moved away from the place where that nearness was most felt. Some scholars suggest that the writer of Genesis is doing something subtle here. By naming the land Nod, this text invites the reader to feel the spiritual climate of Cain's exile. Not only its geography, the land of wandering is a land where the soul cannot fully rest. It is a country where the inner restlessness of guilt finds an outer landscape that matches it. This is one of the quieter strengths of Genesis. It often tells us about the inner world by describing the outer one, and in this case, the outer world is named for the very condition that drove Cain there. The Ethiopian Christian tradition takes this further. In the text preserved by that ancient church, including writings tied to the names of Enoch, Jubilees, and the books of Adam and Eve, Nod is treated as a threshold region, not a hidden realm in the modern sense and not a fantasy land, but a part of the earth where the boundary between the human world and the unseen world was unusually thin. Tradition preserves the idea that in this region, encounters could happen that would have been unthinkable closer to Eden. This is interpretation, not direct biblical statement, and it has been debated for centuries. But it grew out of a careful reading of why Genesis would describe a place in such restless terms. What we begin to see, even at this early stage, is that the simple sentence about Cain settling east of Eden is not as simple as it first appears. A name has been chosen with care, a direction has been chosen with care, and a silence has been placed around the land itself, a silence that older readers tried to listen into rather than past. Yet the silence in the passage may tell us more than we first notice. Chapter 2. The Mark and the Wanderer. Before Cain ever reached the land of Nod, something happened to him that the text describes in only a few words. The Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. That single sentence has carried more interpretation than almost any other line in the early chapters of Genesis. And like the name of Nod itself, the mark is described without being explained. We are not told what it looked like. We are not told what it looked like. We are not told where it was placed. We are not told how others would recognize it. We're only told that it existed and that its purpose was protection. For many readers, this protective function is enough. God, even in the act of judgment, refuses to abandon Cain entirely. The mark becomes a sign of restrained mercy. Cain has taken a life, but his own life will not be taken in return. The cycle of vengeance is interrupted before it can begin. This reading is faithful to the plain sense of the text, and it has comforted generations of believers who saw in the mark a reminder that divine justice and divine mercy are not enemies. But older interpreters, especially those working within the Ethiopian tradition, noticed something else about the mark. They noticed that it was not removed when Cain entered Nod. It traveled with him. It became part of who he was. And they asked whether a mark placed by God on a man who had just committed the first murder might have carried more than one function. Some historical readings hold that the mark was both a shield and a sign. A shield to keep him alive, a sign to keep him visible, both to other people and to whatever else might be present in the land he was entering. This is where the interpretation becomes more delicate, and it must be handled with care. The Ethiopian texts, particularly those connected to the broader Gnostic tradition, suggest that the mark altered Cain's perception in some way. Not in the sense of granting him magical sight, but in the sense of making him aware of a spiritual climate he had not noticed before. Before the murder, Cain lived close to Eden, in a world still warmed by the memory of God's direct presence. After the murder, he stepped into a region where that presence was felt differently. And the mark in this reading became something like a reminder, a constant signal that he was a man who had crossed a line and was now living on the other side of it. It is important to say clearly that this reading is interpretive. Genesis itself does not describe the mark as a change in perception. It describes it only as protection. The deeper reading comes from later tradition, especially from communities that preserved a richer cosmology of angels, watchers, and spiritual geography. These traditions did not invent the idea out of nothing. They drew it from the strangeness of the text itself. A man marked by God, sent into a land named for wandering, who then immediately builds a city and fathers a line of remarkable craftsmen. The biblical narrative moves so quickly that it almost dares the reader to slow down. When we do slow down, we notice that Cain's response to his exile is not collapse. It is construction. He does not wander aimlessly until he dies. He marries, he fathers a son. He builds. The text says he built a city and called it after the name of his son, Enoch. This is a striking detail. The first city in the Bible is built by the first murderer in the land of restlessness and named after his child. There is something both human and unsettling in this picture. Human, because we recognize the impulse to build a future for one's children, even after great failure. Unsettling, because the city rises in a place the text has just described as the country of wandering. Tradition preserves the idea that the city of Enoch was not only a settlement, but a center, a place where Cain's descendants gathered, where skills were developed, where a particular way of living took shape. The Ethiopian writings describe this center as a place where knowledge advanced rapidly, sometimes too rapidly for the moral development of those who held it. This is one of the recurring themes in older readings of Genesis. Knowledge is not condemned, but knowledge separated from the presence of God is treated as dangerous because it can outrun the wisdom needed to carry it. We do not have to accept every detail of these older readings to feel the weight of what Genesis is doing. The text places a murderer, a mark, a wandering land, and a rising city in the same short passage. It refuses to explain how these pieces fit together. It simply lets them sit beside one another, trusting the reader to feel the tension. And the tension is real. A man under judgment becomes a builder. A land of unrest becomes a place of settlement. A mark of protection becomes, in the eyes of later tradition, a sign of something more complicated. And this is where the story becomes harder to ignore. Chapter 3. A city built on restlessness. The city of Enoch sits at the heart of Cain's story, even though Genesis gives it only a single verse. The text tells us that Cain knew his wife, that she conceived and bore Enoch, and that Cain built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son. That is all. No description of its walls, no mention of its streets, no account of how many people lived in it or how it was governed. Yet this single verse marks a turning point in the early chapters of Genesis. Before this moment, the human story unfolds in gardens, fields, and the open ground east of Eden. After this moment, it unfolds in cities. Most people assume the founding of the first city is a neutral event, a simple step in the development of human civilization. But the older readers of Genesis did not see it that way. They noticed that the first city in the Bible is not built in a place of blessing. It is built in the land of Nod. It is built by a man who has just been told that the ground will no longer yield its strength to him. It is built by someone who has been sent out from the presence of the Lord, and they asked what it means that the beginning of urban life in Scripture is tied so closely to exile and judgment. One historical reading holds that the city was an attempt to compensate for what had been lost. Cain could no longer farm the ground as he once had. He could no longer walk freely in the nearness of God. So he built. He built walls. He built order. He built a structure that could shelter his family and hold back the restlessness of the land around them. In this reading, the city is not evil in itself. It is a human response to loss, an attempt to create stability in a place whose very name means instability. There is something deeply familiar about this. People still build cities for the same reasons: to organize life, to protect what they love, to hold back the wildness of the world. But there is another layer that older traditions add. They suggest that the city of Enoch became more than a settlement. It became a kind of center for a way of life that grew distinct from the way of life followed by Adam's other descendants. Seth's line, which Genesis introduces shortly afterward, is described in terms of worship and long memory. Cain's line, by contrast, is described in terms of skill and invention. The text does not condemn Cain's descendants directly. It simply lists their achievements. But the list is unusual. In a few short verses, Genesis tells us that this line produced the first tent-dwelling herdsmen, the first musicians, and the first workers in bronze and iron. That is a remarkable concentration of cultural development in a single family. The Ethiopian tradition, drawing on the Book of Jubilees and related writings, interprets this concentration as significant. It suggests that the rapid advance of skill in Cain's line was not only the result of natural human curiosity. Some scholars suggest that influences from outside the ordinary human world played a role, especially as the story moves toward the days of the Watchers. This remains debated, and the canonical text of Genesis does not say this directly. What Genesis does say is that the line of Cain became distinguished by what it made, and what it made shaped the world. A city in the ancient mind was not only a place to live, it was a statement about how life should be ordered. The walls said something, the gates said something, the placement of homes, workshops, and gathering places said something. To build a city was to declare a vision of human life, and the vision that rose in the land of Nod was a vision shaped by a man who had stepped outside the nearness of God. Whatever else the city of Enoch was, it was an experiment in living apart from that nearness while still trying to flourish. The older readings do not treat this experiment as a simple failure. They treat it as a mixed inheritance. Real beauty came out of Cain's line. Music came out of it. Craftsmanship came out of it. Shelter and tools and the beginnings of organized labor came out of it. These are gifts, and they have blessed human life in countless ways. But The same readings notice that the gifts grew in soil that had been separated from worship. And they ask what happens when human capacity advances faster than human reverence. This question is not a modern invention. It is woven into the texture of Genesis itself. The text places the founding of the city and the listing of its inventions side by side with the growing violence of Cain's descendants, especially in the figure of Lamech, who boasts of killing a man for wounding him. The progression is quiet but pointed. Skill rises, wealth rises, and so does pride. The land of Nod, named for restlessness, becomes a place where human ability is sharpened, but human peace is not. Tradition preserves the idea that the city of Enoch was both a refuge and a laboratory, a refuge from the wildness of the land, and a laboratory for a kind of human life that had never existed before. Whether or not we accept every detail of the older readings, the basic shape of the story is clear. Something new began in Nod, something that would echo through the rest of the early biblical narrative. And what follows does not shout for attention, but it changes how the whole story reads. Chapter 4, The Craft of Forgotten Hands. If you read the genealogy in Genesis 4 slowly, you begin to notice a rhythm. Cain has Enoch. Enoch has Irad. Irad has Mehujael. Mehujael has Methuselah. Methuselah has Lamech. And then the rhythm changes. With Lamech, the text slows down. It tells us about his two wives, Ada and Zillah. It tells us about his children, each one tied to a particular craft. And it tells us about a small, troubling song that Lamech sings to his wives, a song of violence and self-justification. In a few verses, Genesis turns from a list of names into a portrait of a family that has become a culture. Jabal, the son of Ada, is described as the father of those who dwell in tents and have cattle. He's the beginning of a nomadic, pastoral life. His brother Jabal is the father of all those who handle the harp and the pipe. He's the beginning of music. Zillah's son Tubal-Cain is an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. He is the beginning of metalwork. And Tubal-Cain's sister, Naamah, is named but not described. Her name is preserved in the text, but her contribution is left in silence. This short passage carries more weight than many readers notice. In a handful of lines, the Bible tells us where some of the most basic elements of human civilization began: pastoral life, music, metalwork. These are not minor achievements, they are foundations. And the text places all of them in the line of Cain, in the land of Nod after the founding of the first city. The arrangement is deliberate. The writer of Genesis is showing us that the descendants of the wanderer became the makers of the world. There was no condemnation in the text itself. Genesis does not say that hurting is sinful, or that music is sinful, or that metalwork is sinful. It simply records the names and the crafts. But the older interpreter traditions notice that these crafts appear in a particular order and in a particular setting. They appear in the family of a man, Lamech, who openly celebrates violence. They appear in a culture that has grown distant from the worship of God. And they appear just before the text turns, in chapter 5, to the very different line of Seth, where the rhythm of names is interrupted by the simple, repeated phrase, "and he died." Some scholars suggest that the contrast is intentional. Cain's line is remembered for what it made. Seth's line is remembered for how it lived and how it died. One line is described by its products, the other is described by its years. Both lines are human. Both lines carry gifts, but the texture of their stories is different, and the difference matters. The Ethiopian tradition adds a layer of interpretation here that has been preserved for centuries. In the Book of Jubilees and in writings tied to the broader Enochic stream, the skills of Cain's descendants are not seen as purely human discoveries. Tradition preserves the idea that some of these skills were taught, or at least accelerated, by influences from outside the ordinary human world. The metalwork of Tubal-Cain, in particular, is given a strange weight in these older readings. To work iron and bronze in the ancient mind was to bend the elements of the earth to human will. It was a kind of power, and power always carries questions. It is important to handle this carefully. The canonical text of Genesis does not say that Tubal-Cain was taught by angels. It says only that he was an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. The deeper reading comes from later tradition, and it is offered as interpretation, not as settled fact. But the interpretation grew out of a real observation. The crafts of Cain's line advanced quickly, too quickly, in the view of some ancient readers, for a young world. And the question they asked was simple. Where did this knowledge come from? Music carries its own quiet weight in the passage. Jubal is named as the father of all who handle the harp and the pipe. Music is one of the most beautiful gifts in human life. It can lift the soul toward God. It can comfort the grieving. It can carry stories across generations. But music also has another side. It can shape mood without words. It can move people in ways they do not fully understand. The older traditions noticed this dual nature and asked what kind of music first arose in the land of Nod. Was it music of praise? Was it music of lament? Was it music of lament? Was it music of celebration without reference to the Maker? The text does not say. It only tells us that music began here, in this family, in this place. Naamah, whose name closes the list, is the most mysterious figure. She is named but not described. Her brothers are tied to crafts. She is tied to nothing the text will say aloud. Tradition has filled this silence in various ways across the centuries. Some readings treating her as a figure of beauty, others as a figure of influence, others simply as a name preserved because she mattered to someone. The honest answer is that Genesis does not tell us. Her silence is part of the texture of the chapter, a reminder that the early biblical narrative often holds back more than it reveals. What we are left with is a portrait of a culture that has learned to make tents and herds, music and instruments, bronze and iron, a culture that has produced gifts the world still uses, and a culture that has done all of this in a land named for restlessness, in a line marked by violence, far from the nearness of God. The achievement is real. The shadow over it is also real. And the deeper meaning begins to emerge here. Chapter 5, The Watchers and the Mountain. To understand why the early chapters of Genesis carry such weight in the Ethiopian tradition, we have to turn for a moment to a passage that has puzzled readers for centuries. Genesis 6 opens with a strange sentence. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. The text continues a few verses later with another striking line. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. These verses are short. They are also unusual. They sit in the middle of a narrative that has been moving steadily through generations, and they suddenly introduce a category that has not appeared before, the sons of God. The text does not stop to explain who they are. It assumes the reader knows, or at least assumes that the reader will recognize the phrase from elsewhere. And this is part of why older traditions reached for additional writings to make sense of the passage. In the canonical Old Testament, the phrase sons of God appears most clearly in the book of Job, where it refers to heavenly beings who present themselves before the Lord. Some scholars suggest that the same usage is in view in Genesis 6, and that the verses describe a moment when beings from the heavenly council crossed a boundary they were not meant to cross. Other scholars hold that the phrase refers to the godly line of Seth intermarrying with the corrupt line of Cain. This remains debated, and faithful readers have held both views across the centuries. The Ethiopian tradition leans strongly toward the first reading, and it draws on a much fuller account preserved in the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is not part of the canonical Bible in most Christian traditions. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, however, it has been preserved and read for centuries. It expands the brief verses of Genesis 6 into a longer narrative. In its account, a group of heavenly beings called the Watchers descended to the earth in the days before the flood. They came to a mountain, often identified in the text as Mount Hermon, and they bound themselves with an oath to a particular course of action. They would take wives from among the daughters of men, and they would teach humanity things that had not been given to them. It is important to say clearly that this is interpretive tradition, not canonical biblical narrative for most readers. The Book of Enoch fills in details that Genesis itself does not provide, but the older communities that preserved this book did not see it as competition with Genesis. They saw it as commentary on Genesis, an attempt to understand a passage that the original text leaves deliberately spare. Whether or not one accepts the details, the underlying question is real. Why does Genesis 6 speak of sons of God and daughters of men in the same breath as the rising violence that would soon bring the flood? The Watchers in the Enochic tradition are not portrayed as monsters. They are portrayed as beings who had a role to play in the order of creation and who stepped outside that role. Their failure is not in their power, but in their choice. They were meant to watch. They chose to interfere, and the consequences of that choice unfolded across generations. The tradition describes the teaching of the Watchers in specific terms. They taught the working of metals into weapons. They taught the cutting of stones and the making of ornaments. They taught certain arts that altered the way human beings related to one another and to the unseen world. The list reads like a darker echo of the achievements already recorded in Genesis 4: metalwork, adornment, skills that shape culture. The parallel is not accidental. Older readers saw continuity between the crafts that arose in the line of Cain and the teachings that came through the Watchers. One historical reading holds that the land of Nod was already a region where this kind of influence was possible, and that the Watchers' later descent intensified what had already begun there. The offspring of the Watchers and human women are called Nephilim in Genesis, a word that has been translated as giants, but that carries broader meanings of fallen ones or those who cause others to fall. The Enochic tradition describes them as beings of great size and great violence, whose presence on the earth contributed to the moral collapse that preceded the flood. Genesis itself is sparing on the details. It says only that the earth was filled with violence, and that every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. The canonical text gives us the moral picture. The Ethiopian tradition fills in the figures who walk through it. What matters for our reflection is not whether we accept every detail of the Enochic account, but that we notice how the early traditions read Genesis. They read it as a story in which the human and the unseen worlds were not always cleanly separated. They read it as a story in which choices made by spiritual beings had consequences on the earth. And they read it as a story in which the land of Nod, the city of Enoch, the crafts of Cain's line, and the descent of the Watchers were not isolated episodes, but parts of a single unfolding pattern. The mountain where the Watchers are said to have bound themselves stands at the edge of this pattern, like a quiet warning, a high place, an oath, a choice that could not be undone. The text does not shout, it simply records. And in the recording, it leaves a question that has stayed with readers for thousands of years. What happens when those who were meant to watch decide instead to act? Yet the text opens another layer. Chapter 6, 2 bloodlines, 1 earth. By the time Genesis reaches its 6th chapter, the human family has divided into 2 long lines, each carrying its own memory and its own character. The line of Cain stretches from the land of Nod outward, marked by cities, crafts, and a growing distance from the worship that had once filled Eden. The line of Seth stretches in a different direction, marked by long lives, quiet faithfulness, and the simple repeated note that these were men who called upon the name of the Lord. The 2 lines are not described in the same way. They are not given the same details. And the difference between them shapes everything that follows. Seth is introduced almost as a gift. After the death of Abel and the exile of Cain, Eve gives birth to another son and says that God has appointed her another seed. The wording matters. Seth is not simply a replacement child. He is a continuation of a promise. Through his line, the text traces a path that will eventually reach Noah, and through Noah, the rest of human history. The line of Seth is the line of memory. It carries forward what was lost when Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. Genesis 5 lays out this line with a striking rhythm. Adam lived so many years and begat a son. The son lived so many years and begat another son, and he died. The phrase repeats again and again. And he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. The repetition is not accidental. It is a kind of slow music, a reminder that even in the line of promise, mortality holds its place. The ages are long, far longer than anything we know now, but the end is always the same. The line of Seth is honest about death in a way that the line of Cain, with its focus on building and making, is not. The two lines are not described as enemies in the early chapters. They live in the same world. They share the same ancestors. They drink from the same earth. But the texture of their lives is different. Seth's line is described in terms of generations and worship. Cain's line is described in terms of cities and inventions. Both lines are human. Both lines carry gifts. But the orientations are not the same. One looks back toward Eden and forward toward what God will do. The other looks outward toward what human hands can build. The Ethiopian tradition, drawing on the Book of Jubilees and related writings, develops this contrast in interpretive ways. Tradition preserves the idea that the descendants of Seth lived for a long time in a kind of separation from the descendants of Cain, often pictured as dwelling in higher regions, while Cain's line spread across the plains and valleys. This is interpretation, not direct biblical statement. The canonical text does not describe a strict geographic division, but the interpretation grew out of a real reading of the text, which presents the two lines as having very different ways of life. The turning point comes in Genesis 6 when the lines begin to mix. The sons of God, however we understand that phrase, take wives from the daughters of men. The careful separation that had existed begins to dissolve, and as it dissolves, the moral condition of the earth changes. The text says that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This is not a quiet decline. It is described as a flooding of evil into every corner of human life. Older readers ask why the mixing of the lines led to such a sharp moral collapse. One historical reading holds that the line of Seth, which had carried the memory of worship, lost its distinctiveness when it joined itself to a culture that had grown up apart from that worship. Another reading, drawn from the Enochic tradition, holds that the mixing involved more than human intermarriage, that the influence of the Watchers had spread through the descendants of Cain in ways that affected the spiritual climate of the entire earth. These readings are not identical, and they have been debated for centuries. But they share a common observation. Something happened in the generations before the flood that made the earth unrecognizable to its maker. The canonical text expresses this in language that is almost grief-stricken. It says that it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. These are not the words of a distant judge. They are the words of a heart that has been wounded by what its creation has become. The Hebrew language here carries a depth of feeling that is sometimes lost in translation. The God of Genesis is not described as angry in the way a tyrant is angry. He is described as sorrowful in the way a parent is sorrowful when a child has gone far astray. And yet, even in this grief, the text preserves a small light. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. The line of Seth, though it had mixed with the line of Cain, had not entirely disappeared. A single family still walked in a way that God could recognize. Noah is described as a just man and perfect in his generations, and he walked with God. The wording echoes what was said earlier about Enoch, the seventh from Adam in the line of Seth, who walked with God and was not, for God took him. Across the long centuries between Enoch and Noah, the line of faithful walking had grown thin, but it had not broken. This is part of why the early biblical narrative carries such weight. It does not present the human story as a simple decline. It presents it as a slow, complicated unfolding in which gifts and failures grow side by side, in which two lines diverge and then converge, in which the earth fills with both invention and violence. and it places at the center of this unfolding a quiet, persistent thread of faithfulness that refuses to disappear. The thread is small, but it is enough. Chapter 7, The Weight That Brought the Flood. The flood does not arrive suddenly in Genesis. It arrives slowly, after pages of names, generations, and quiet observations about what the world has become. The text builds toward it carefully. It tells us about the mixing of the lines. It tells us about the violence that has filled the earth. It tells us about the grief in the heart of God. And only then does it tell us about Noah, the ark, and the waters that will cover the mountains. The pacing matters. The flood is not presented as a divine outburst. It is presented as a response to a condition that had become unbearable for the creation itself. Genesis 6 uses a particular phrase that older readers found striking. The earth was filled with violence. The Hebrew word translated as violence carries a sense of cruelty, oppression, and disorder. It is the word used elsewhere in Scripture for the kind of wrong that cries out from the ground. And in Genesis 6, the text says that the earth itself was filled with this cruelty. The land that had once been called good in the opening chapters of Genesis had become a place where harm was the ordinary texture of life. The text adds another phrase that is easy to pass over. It says that the earth was corrupt before God. The word corrupt carries the sense of being ruined, spoiled, or rendered unfit for its purpose. It is the language one would use of a vessel that has been damaged beyond ordinary repair. The earth, in the eyes of God, had become such a vessel, not because the soil itself had failed, but because the life that filled it had grown so far from its design that the design itself was at risk. The Ethiopian tradition, drawing on the broader Enoch extreme, interprets this corruption in layered terms. It speaks not only of moral corruption, but of a deeper disturbance in the order of creation. Tradition preserves the idea that the presence of the Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, had introduced something into the world that did not belong there. Some scholars suggest that the biblical phrase about every kind reproducing after its kind repeated so carefully in the creation narrative is in the background of the flood story. The orderly distinctions that God had built into creation had been violated, and the violation could not be left in place. It is important to handle this carefully. The canonical text of Genesis does not describe the flood as a genetic cleansing. It describes the flood as a response to violence and to the universal corruption of human imagination. The deeper reading, in which the flood addresses a disturbance involving the Watchers and their offspring, comes from later tradition. The two readings are not necessarily in conflict. The canonical text gives us the moral picture. The interpretive tradition gives us a fuller account of the spiritual and creational dimensions that older readers saw behind the moral picture. What both readings share is the recognition that the flood was not arbitrary. It was a response to a real condition, and the condition had developed slowly across generations through the choices of human beings and, in the older readings, through the choices of spiritual beings as well. The land of Nod, the city of Enoch, the crafts of Cain's line, the descent of the Watchers, the mixing of the bloodlines, the rise of the Nephilim, the spread of violence, the grief of God. These are not isolated events. They are stages in a single, unfolding weight that finally became too heavy for the earth to carry without judgment. Noah stands inside this weight as a quiet exception. The text says he was perfect in his generation. The word translated as perfect does not mean sinless. It means whole, complete, of one piece. In a world where the lines had mixed and the bloodlines had been disturbed, Noah is described as a man whose life was still of one piece, still oriented toward the God of his fathers. He walked with God in a generation that no longer knew how to walk that way. And because he walked, a future was preserved. The building of the ark is described in practical terms. Dimensions are given, materials are named, the animals are gathered, the provisions are stored. There is no drama in the description, no rising music, no shouted warnings. There is only the slow, patient work of a man who believed what he had been told and acted accordingly. The text suggests that this work took a long time, and that during this time, the rest of the world continued as it had been. People ate, people drank, People married. People did not change. When the waters finally come, the text describes them in language that recalls the opening of Genesis. The fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. The phrasing is deliberate. In the beginning, God had separated the waters above from the waters below to make a space for life. In the flood, that separation is temporarily undone. The waters return, the space collapses. The creation itself seems to step back toward the formless state from which it had been called. And then, after many days, the waters recede and the earth begins again. This is one of the deepest patterns in Genesis: creation, disturbance, judgment, renewal. The pattern does not erase what came before. The memory of Eden remains. The memory of Cain remains. The memory of the watchers in the older traditions remains. But a new beginning is given. Noah steps off the ark into a world that is both old and new. He builds an altar. He offers a sacrifice, and the text says that the Lord smelled a sweet savor and said in his heart that he would not again curse the ground for man's sake. The promise is gentle, almost quiet. A rainbow is set in the sky. The seasons are pledged to continue. The story moves forward. But the weight that brought the flood does not entirely disappear from memory. It lingers in the early chapters of Genesis like a warning preserved for those who would come later. And this is where the silence in the passage may tell us more than we first notice. Chapter 8. What Nod left behind. When the floodwaters receded, the land of Nod as a physical place passed out of the story. Genesis does not mention it again. The cities of Cain's line are not described as rebuilt. The names of his descendants do not reappear in the genealogies that follow Noah. The world that had grown up east of Eden, with its tents and harps and bronze and iron, is gone from the surface of the text. And yet, when older readers look carefully at the chapters that follow, they notice that something of Nod seemed to linger. Not as a place, but as a pattern. The pattern is not difficult to describe, though it is uncomfortable to name. It is the pattern of human capacity advancing faster than human reverence. It is the pattern of skill growing in soil that has been separated from worship. It is the pattern of cities rising in regions of restlessness, of knowledge being pursued without reference to the one who gives it, of communities organizing themselves around what they can make rather than around what they have been given. This pattern did not begin in Nod, but Nod gave it a particular shape, and the shape proved durable. Genesis itself hints at the durability. Not long after the flood, the text tells us about the building of another city, this time on a plain in the land of Shinar. The builders say to one another, "Let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." They say, "Let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The echoes are quiet but unmistakable. Brick replaces stone. A tower replaces a city wall. A desire to make a name replaces the simple impulse to shelter a family. The patterns from before the flood return, dressed in new materials. The Ethiopian tradition, with its longer memory of the watchers in the Nephilim, sees these post-flood echoes as part of a continuing story. Tradition preserves the idea that something of the spiritual climate that filled the pre-flood world did not entirely disappear with the waters. The Nephilim are mentioned again in later biblical passages, in the reports of the spies who entered the Promised Land and saw beings they described as giants. The canonical text is restrained about what these later figures were. The interpretive tradition is less restrained, and readers have debated for centuries how to weigh these later mentions. What is not debated is that Genesis treats the early chapters as foundational. The pattern that took shape in Nod, the impulse to build apart from God, to gather knowledge without wisdom, to organize life around human achievement rather than around divine presence, is treated by the rest of Scripture as a recurring temptation. The prophets warn against it. The Psalms lament it. The wisdom literature describes it from many angles, and the New Testament, when it looks back, often reaches for the language of the flood in the days of Noah to describe conditions that might return. This is part of why the older traditions held the early chapters of Genesis so closely. They did not see them as quaint stories about a distant past. They saw them as a kind of map, a map of how human life can go wrong, and of how God responds when it does. The land of Nod, in this map, is not only a place where Cain went. It is a way of being that the human heart can choose in any generation, in any culture, in any setting. And the warning of Genesis is that this way of being, however productive it may seem, carries a weight that eventually has to be reckoned with. It would be easy to read these chapters with despair, as if they describe only failure. But that is not what the text does. Even in its quietest moments, Genesis preserves the thread of grace. Adam and Eve are clothed before they are sent out of the garden. Cain is marked for protection before he is sent into Nod. The line of Seth is given as another seed before the human story has fully unfolded. Enoch is taken up before the corruption reaches its full weight. Noah is found in grace before the flood begins. The pattern of judgment is real, but it is always shadowed by a pattern of preservation. Both patterns run through the early chapters like two threads in the same cloth. For modern readers, the question is not only what these chapters meant to ancient people, it is what they ask of us now. The early biblical narrative does not give us a system, it gives us a story, and the story invites us to notice the shape of our own lives. Are we building in our own way in a land that has grown restless? Are we gathering skills and knowledge faster than we are gathering wisdom? Are we letting the presence of God become a memory rather than a daily reality? These are not questions designed to produce shame. They are questions designed to produce honesty. And honesty, in the world of Genesis, is always the first step back toward grace. The Ethiopian tradition, in preserving the longer accounts of Nod, the Watchers, and the days before the flood, was not trying to add drama to a simple story. It was trying to keep certain warnings visible. Whether or not we accept every detail of those older writings, the basic shape of their concern is consistent with what Genesis itself says. The human heart is capable of remarkable things, both beautiful and ruinous. The world is shaped by the choices we make about which capabilities to feed. And the nearness of God, which Cain walked away from on the day he went east of Eden, remains available to those who turn back toward it. If this kind of reflection stays with you, you may find that it changes how you read the early chapters of Genesis the next time you open them. The names will not pass as quickly. The places will not seem as small. The brief verses about a city in the land of Nod will carry a weight you had not noticed before. And the long, patient story that runs from Eden to the flood and from the flood to everything that follows will feel less like an ancient record and more like a quiet conversation that the text has been trying to have with its readers all along. The land of Nod is gone. The pattern it left behind is not. And the invitation, which has always been the deepest gift of these chapters, remains the same as it was in the beginning: to walk with God, to live within His nearness, to build, if we build, on ground that has not been separated from His presence. The story does not end with Nod. It begins again, in every generation, with those who choose to listen.